I didn't realize how dangerous silence could be until the morning my daughter slid an envelope across my kitchen table and smiled like she was doing me a favor. Because that smile, soft, trusting, familiar, was the same one she used when she was 6 years old and handing me a drawing she was proud of. And yet this time, something in my chest tightened so sharply, I had to wrap both hands around my coffee mug just to stay grounded, as if the ceramic warmth could anchor me to the moment and keep me from drifting into the terrible certainty that something was already wrong. Even though the house smelled like fresh coffee and lemon cleaner, and nothing outwardly looked broken at all. She had been married for exactly 2 days, still glowing in that way brides do when reality hasn't caught up with romance yet. Her ring flashing every time she moved her hand, while her husband sat beside her far too comfortably, one arm draped behind her chair like he'd already memorized the dimensions of my kitchen and decided it belonged to him. And when he pushed the envelope toward me, he didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't even look nervous, which should have been my first real warning, because men with nothing to hide always hesitate just a little. He spoke calmly, smoothly, using words that sounded harmless enough. Planning, alignment, future security. Words people use when they want you to stop listening closely, and my daughter nodded along beside him, eager, hopeful, trusting him the way she once trusted me, saying it was just a formality, something smart couples did, something I'd understand because I'd always been practical, and I wanted to interrupt her right then. Wanted to ask why paperwork was appearing before the wedding thank you cards had even been written, but I didn't, because part of me needed to see how far this would go. I waited until they left, until the door closed behind them and the house returned to its familiar quiet, before I opened the envelope with hands that trembled just enough to surprise me, because inside wasn't a suggestion or a proposal but a fully drafted agreement, heavy with legal language, my name already printed as if consent were a given, outlining how certain family assets could be allocated into a trust structure overseen by my new son-in-law. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. Because you don't draft documents like that, unless you believe there's something worth reaching for. I sat at the same table where I once helped my daughter with spelling words, and realized that the most dangerous thing I'd ever done wasn't inheriting money. It was keeping quiet about it. My husband had been gone long enough now that the grief had softened around the edges, but not long enough for people to forget he'd been careful, strategic, private, and when he died, what he left me wasn't just money, it was insulation, distance, the ability to watch instead of react, because the truth was I hadn't inherited a modest sum or something easily explained away. I'd inherited $7 million, quietly, deliberately, locked behind structures and accounts my daughter didn't even know existed, not because I didn't trust her, but because money has a way of changing the direction of love without warning, and I had promised myself I wouldn't let it touch her life until it absolutely had to. As I read through the agreement, I could see exactly how it was designed, not to steal outright, but to funnel to position, to create access later under the guise of family unity. And what unsettled me most wasn't the document itself, but how confidently it had been delivered, how naturally my daughter had accepted it, as if someone had already whispered reassurance into her ear that I was being overly cautious, overly protective, maybe even selfish. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking, replaying every interaction, every look, every word, and wondering when curiosity had turned into calculation. And by morning, I knew one thing for certain. Refusing outright would teach me nothing. Confronting him would only make him retreat, but silence, carefully placed, intentional silence, would invite the truth to reveal itself. I didn't need to accuse anyone. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't even need to protect the money yet, because it was already protected. What I needed was confirmation, proof that my instincts weren't shaped by grief or paranoia, but by experience. And as I sat there watching sunlight stretch across the kitchen floor, I understood that whatever came next would decide more than finances. It would decide whether my daughter's future would be shaped by love or quietly dismantled by someone who thought patience was weakness. I folded the contract back into the envelope and placed it neatly in a drawer, not to hide it, but to let it wait, because the most revealing moves are always made when someone believes they have time. And I was about to give him just enough rope to show me exactly who he was, even if it meant becoming the villain in my daughter's eyes before I could ever be her shield again. And the strangest part was this: I wasn't angry yet, because deep down, I knew the next move wouldn't be mine. The first sign that I wasn't imagining things came not with a confrontation, but with a knock on my door at 9 in the morning, a knock that was too confident, too practiced, the kind that assumes it will be answered politely. And when I opened it, I wasn't looking at my son-in-law or my daughter, but at a young man in a sharply pressed suit, holding a briefcase like he'd rehearsed this moment in a mirror, smiling with the kind of professional friendliness that dissolves the moment you ask a real question. And before I could even invite him in, he spoke my name as if it were already printed on a file somewhere, explaining that he was here on behalf of my daughter and her husband, regarding an urgent financial addendum. And that word, urgent, lodged itself in my chest, because nothing involving newlyweds should ever be urgent unless someone is afraid of time. I let him inside, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to see how bold they were willing to be. And as he laid the papers across my dining table, the same table where my daughter once spilled nail polish and cried like it was the end of the world, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a follow-up, this was escalation. He spoke smoothly, explaining that the addendum was a precaution, a way to streamline future planning, a way to ensure transparency among family assets. And when he casually mentioned that my daughter had already signed it, my stomach tightened in a way grief never managed to do, because love can blind people, but paperwork makes blindness permanent. I asked him to point out the relevant section, and when he hesitated just a fraction before directing my attention to a clause requiring disclosure of parental estates and expected inheritances, I knew exactly what they were fishing for, and it wasn't protection. It was information. I watched his eyes while he talked, the way they flicked up when he mentioned trust structures, the way his tone softened when he said equitable distribution. And I thought of all the men I'd watched circle my husband's estate after the funeral, smiling sympathetically while measuring the room. And suddenly this didn't feel new at all. It felt familiar, like a pattern repeating itself with a different face. I asked whether my daughter had actually read what she signed, and his answer was polite but dismissive, something about trust and unity. And that was when I understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about leverage, about creating a situation where backing out later would look like betrayal, not caution. I didn't sign, of course, but I didn't refuse either, because refusal would have ended the game too early. And instead I told him I'd need my own legal review, watching carefully as surprise flickered across his face before he masked it with professionalism. And when he left, carrying his briefcase a little tighter than before, I stood alone in my quiet house and felt something click into place. They were circling, not waiting. That afternoon, I called my attorney, a man who knew me well enough not to ask unnecessary questions, and I told him I didn't want defense yet. I wanted observation, something subtle, something that would look like a mistake to anyone greedy enough to exploit it. And when he paused before responding, I knew he understood exactly what I meant. Over the next few days, I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed over decades of protecting myself. I let things appear messy. I left documents out, references to old accounts, numbers that looked just interesting enough to be tempting but not impressive enough to trigger caution, and I watched the silence stretch, because silence makes impatient people reckless. My daughter didn't call, didn't check in, and I knew why. Someone had already framed me as difficult, cautious, maybe even controlling, and I accepted that role without protest. Because control doesn't require approval, it requires timing. When the alert came from the bank, it wasn't dramatic, just a quiet notification about an attempted access on a dormant account. But the name used made my breath catch, because it wasn't current, it wasn't public. It was a name tied to a chapter of my life only two people knew about, and one of them was buried. That was the moment doubt disappeared entirely, replaced by certainty so clean it almost felt like relief, because suspicion is exhausting, but confirmation is energizing. I didn't react, didn't call anyone, didn't warn my daughter, because the trap wasn't sprung yet. And the most revealing mistakes happen when someone believes they're close enough to taste victory. That night, as I sat alone in my study, holding two documents, one real, one carefully constructed, I made a decision that would cost me my daughter's trust before it would save her future, and I understood something most people learn too late. Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to let them think you're wrong. I folded the papers away, turned off the light, and waited, because I knew the next move wouldn't involve contracts or lawyers, it would involve impatience. And when impatience shows itself, it never does so quietly. I still hadn't said a word. But by then, I knew exactly what he would try next, and that's when I stopped waiting. I learned something important the week after the bank alert. Something people don't tell you about manipulation until it's already happened to them. And that is how quickly silence gets rewritten into guilt when someone else controls the narrative. Because before I could even decide how to respond, my daughter called me with a voice that sounded careful, rehearsed, like she was walking through a room full of glass she didn't want to break, and she asked me, gently, apologetically, why I had threatened her husband. And in that moment, I understood just how fast the ground can shift under your feet when someone gets ahead of the truth. I didn't argue with her, didn't deny it outright, because denial invites debate and debate invites distortion. So instead I asked what she meant, letting her words tumble out in fragments about raised voices that never happened, accusations that were never spoken, about how he felt uncomfortable, blindsided, attacked. And as she talked, I could hear the strain in her voice, the confusion, the way she was trying to hold two versions of reality at once. The mother, who had protected her all her life, and the husband she had just promised to trust above everyone else. When she finished, I said only one thing, that I hadn't signed anything, and that I wouldn't, not without understanding it fully, and the pause that followed told me everything I needed to know, because someone had already taught her that caution was hostility. After we hung up, I didn't cry, not yet, but something heavy settled in my chest, because I could feel the emotional cost of staying quiet beginning to rise, and I knew it would get worse before it got better. That afternoon, I received a message from my attorney confirming what I already suspected. The access attempt hadn't come from me, the device signature didn't match anything I'd ever used, and the login had originated from a location tied directly to where my daughter and her husband had stayed after the wedding. And even then, I didn't act, because evidence is only powerful when it's complete, and half-truths can be turned against you faster than lies. Instead, I let the misunderstanding breathe, let my daughter sit with discomfort, because rushing to explain would only sound defensive, and defense is exactly what manipulators count on. 2 days later, my daughter suggested lunch. Her tone overly cheerful, overly polite, the way people sound when they're bracing themselves. And I agreed immediately, because I wanted to see him again, not to confront him, but to observe what confidence looks like when it's starting to crack. The restaurant was quiet, elegant, chosen carefully, and when they arrived, he looked relaxed, smiling easily, as if the situation had already resolved in his favor, while my daughter looked tired, pulled thin between loyalty and doubt, and I greeted them both warmly, because warmth disarms suspicion better than accusation ever could. We talked about harmless things at first, travel plans, the wedding, trivial inconveniences, and then, slowly, he brought the paperwork back into the conversation, this time framed as reconciliation, as a chance to clear the air, and I watched closely as he slid the folder toward me again, noticing how his fingers lingered just a moment too long on the edge, like he was anchoring himself to the outcome. I listened, nodded, and then did exactly what he didn't expect. I thanked him, sincerely, for being concerned about my future, and the shift in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, because gratitude disrupts scripts, and he hadn't rehearsed for that. I told them I'd reviewed my finances, that there wasn't much to discuss, and when I placed the decoy document on the table, explaining calmly that my inheritance had been modest, largely consumed by debts and downsizing, I felt the air around us change, because greed has a very specific reaction to disappointment, and it always leaks through the mask. He smiled, of course, said all the right things about family not being about money, about trust and unity, but his eyes had already moved on, calculating, reassessing, deciding whether the game was still worth playing. And when I added, casually, that I planned to consolidate what little remained into a conservative retirement account, something inaccessible, something dull, I saw it then, the flash of urgency he tried to hide, the subtle tension in his jaw. Because suddenly time mattered again. The lunch ended politely, hugs exchanged, promises made. But as I watched them walk away, I knew the real test was coming, because when someone believes the prize is slipping away, they don't retreat, they rush. That night, I slept lightly, not from fear, but from anticipation, because I understood now that the trap wasn't about money at all. It was about choice, about seeing whether he would respect boundaries when there was nothing to gain, or whether he would reach anyway, and I suspected I already knew the answer. The call came just before dawn, my banker's voice careful, professional, explaining that a full withdrawal request had been attempted on the account I'd referenced, using credentials tied to my daughter's device. And for the first time since this began, my hands shook. Not because I was surprised, but because the confirmation carried weight, because it meant the man sleeping beside my daughter had crossed a line he could never uncross. I thanked the banker, hung up, and sat in the quiet of my house, realizing that the story had just turned, not outwardly, not publicly, but irreversibly, and that from this moment on, there would be no misunderstanding left to hide behind, only choices already made. By morning, I wasn't wondering if he would expose himself anymore. I was deciding how long I would let him believe he hadn't already done it. There's a strange clarity that comes when suspicion finally becomes certainty, and I felt it the moment I hung up the phone with my banker, because fear disappears when the question mark does, and all that's left is understanding, sharp and cold, settling into place like a final piece of a puzzle you wish you'd never started. I didn't rush to call my daughter, didn't confront anyone, didn't even stand up right away. Because this wasn't a moment for movement, it was a moment for stillness, for letting the weight of what had just happened sink in fully, because the man she married hadn't just tested a boundary, he'd stepped cleanly over it, quietly, deliberately, believing he was unseen. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, ordinary sounds that felt almost mocking in their normalcy, because nothing in my life had ever been ordinary again from that point forward. He hadn't asked, hadn't discussed, hadn't clarified. He'd acted, and that was the most revealing thing of all, because people show you exactly who they are when they believe the reward justifies the risk. I replayed the banker's words in my head, the unfamiliar device, the login timestamp, the location matching where they'd stayed after the wedding, and I understood something painful but undeniable. This wasn't impulse, it was preparation. He hadn't stumbled onto the information. He'd been waiting for it, watching, calculating, and when he thought he had enough, he reached. And I let him. That was the part that would haunt me later, not because it was wrong, but because it was necessary, because stopping him would have protected my money but not my daughter, and I was finally seeing the difference between the two. I made coffee and drank it slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're bracing yourself for something you can't avoid. And as the sky outside began to lighten, I made a quiet decision not to act on emotion, not to rush toward exposure, but to let the truth continue unfolding on its own momentum, because now that he believed he'd found the inheritance, now that he believed it was accessible, he wouldn't stop at one attempt. People like him never do. I checked my phone, half expecting a message, an apology, an explanation, but there was nothing, no panic, no confusion, just silence, and that silence told me everything I needed to know, because innocence is loud when it's accused, and guilt prefers to wait and see if it's been noticed. Hours passed. I went about my morning as normally as I could, answered emails, watered plants, folded laundry, all the while aware that somewhere, in a hotel room or a rented car or a coffee shop with unreliable Wi-Fi, he was probably recalculating, deciding whether the failure was technical or temporary, whether to try again or pretend nothing had happened. The thought made my stomach twist, not with fear, but with grief, because my daughter was still unaware, still sleeping beside a man who had just proven he was willing to take from her without her knowledge, and there is no betrayal more intimate than that. By mid-morning, I received a text from her, casual, almost cheerful, asking if we could talk later. saying they were resting and catching up on sleep, and I stared at the screen for a long time before responding with something equally neutral, equally polite, because the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is when one side knows the truth and the other doesn't know they've been exposed yet. I spent the rest of the day preparing quietly, not documents or evidence, but myself, reminding myself that anger would only give him something to push against, and that silence, controlled, intentional, was still my strongest position. When night came, I didn't sleep much, but not because I was afraid he'd come knocking with another contract or another excuse, but because I was thinking about timing, about the precise moment when knowledge becomes power, and how revealing it too early can actually weaken its impact. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, another alert came through, smaller this time, subtler, a login attempt without a transaction request, like someone checking a door handle to see if it's been unlocked, and I almost smiled, not because I felt victorious, but because the pattern was complete now. He wasn't confused, he wasn't mistaken, he was persistent. That persistence was the proof I needed, the kind that doesn't rely on interpretation or emotion, only behavior, and I knew then that even if my daughter never believed me, even if she chose him over me, the truth would eventually surface, because people like him can't help but repeat themselves. The hardest part wasn't waiting for the right moment. It was accepting that the right moment might come at the cost of my relationship with her, that she might see my silence as cruelty, my restraint as manipulation, and that I would have to carry that quietly, too, because protecting someone sometimes means letting them walk straight into the truth on their own terms. I turned off my phone, sat in the dark, and allowed myself one brief moment of grief for the version of my daughter who still believed love was always safe. Because by the time this ended, she would be different, stronger maybe, but changed, and I knew deep down that this was the last night before everything shifted, before silence stopped being passive and became decisive. By the next morning, the trap was no longer theoretical, and the person who would pay the highest price for his greed still didn't know whose side I was really on. The most painful part of keeping a secret isn't the silence itself. It's watching the people you love fill that silence with the wrong explanations. And I understood that fully the moment my daughter finally came to see me alone, her posture stiff, her eyes guarded, like she was stepping into a courtroom instead of the kitchen where she'd grown up. She didn't sit right away, just stood near the counter twisting her ring, and before I could say a word, she asked me why I hated her husband. And that question, so simple, so misplaced, cut deeper than anything he had done so far, because it told me exactly how the story had been framed when I wasn't in the room. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew the wrong answer would push her further away. And when I finally spoke, all I said was that I didn't hate anyone, that I was worried. And she let out a shaky laugh like worry itself had become an insult. She told me he felt attacked, that he thought I didn't trust him, that I was trying to control their marriage before it had even begun. And as she spoke, I recognized the language. Not hers, but his, words carefully chosen to make concern sound like manipulation and boundaries sound like threats. I asked her gently if she'd noticed anything strange, any small inconsistencies, and she bristled immediately, saying I was overthinking, that grief had made me suspicious, that not every action had a hidden agenda, and I listened without interrupting, because every sentence she spoke confirmed what I already knew. He had reached her first. When I told her I'd received a bank alert, her face went pale, not with understanding, but with disbelief, insisting there had to be a mistake, that he wouldn't touch anything without telling her, that he didn't even know how to access my accounts. And that was the moment I realized how completely she'd handed him her trust, not just emotionally, but practically. Passwords, devices, access, things she hadn't even thought twice about. I didn't show her the evidence yet, didn't tell her about the second login attempt, didn't mention how calculated it all was, because dumping truth too early can sound like desperation, and desperation looks a lot like guilt when someone's already been coached to see it that way. Instead, I asked her one question, quiet and simple, whether he'd ever rushed paperwork before, whether he'd ever asked her to sign something quickly, just to get it out of the way. and she hesitated just long enough for doubt to flicker before she shut it down, saying that marriages involve compromise, that finances were complicated, that he was just trying to be responsible. She left shortly after, saying she needed space, and as the door closed behind her, I felt something inside me fracture, not break, but shift, because I understood then that I was no longer just fighting his manipulation. I was fighting the story he'd planted in her mind, one where I was the obstacle, not the shield. That night, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of what he'd do next, but because I was grieving the fact that my daughter now questioned my intentions, and grief has a way of making even the strongest resolve feel heavy. By morning, my phone buzzed with a message from her that was short, formal, distant, asking me not to interfere, asking me to trust her judgment, asking me, politely, to step back. And I stared at those words for a long time before realizing that this was exactly what he wanted: distance, isolation, separation. Because control works best when it eliminates competing voices. I didn't reply right away. I called my attorney instead, not for strategy this time, but for confirmation, for reassurance that I wasn't imagining the shape of what was happening. And when he told me calmly that this pattern was textbook, that he'd seen it dozens of times before, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, because being right doesn't always feel like winning. Later that day, another notification came through, not a withdrawal attempt this time, but a change request, subtle, procedural, someone probing for weaknesses. And that was when I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't about one inheritance or one account. This was about access, about control, about establishing dominance before anyone realized what was happening. I saved everything, documented everything, and still said nothing to my daughter. Because the hardest part of silent revenge isn't the waiting. It's watching the person you love drift further into danger while trusting that the truth, once undeniable, will do what warnings never could. As the sun set that evening, I sat alone at my table and accepted something I'd been resisting all along. This wasn't going to end quietly, and it wasn't going to end quickly. But when it did end, there would be no confusion left about who had crossed the line first. And just when I thought the damage couldn't deepen, without exploding into the open, he made a move that finally forced the truth into the light. I knew the silence was about to break the moment my daughter stopped answering my calls, because silence chosen for strategy feels different from silence imposed by fear, and this one carried weight, the kind that presses on your chest and makes you replay every conversation you've ever had, wondering where the turning point really was. Days passed without a word from her, and when she finally did reach out, it wasn't with warmth or confusion, but with distance, a message asking me to respect her marriage, to stop digging, to let things go. And reading it felt like watching a door close slowly while knowing exactly who was standing behind it, holding the handle. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, because I understood something critical now. If I pushed, I'd become the villain he'd already painted me to be: the overbearing mother, the paranoid widow, the obstacle to their happiness. And once that story settles in someone's mind, facts struggle to survive. Instead, I waited, not passively, but deliberately, because people who believe they've won always get careless. The proof came late one night in the form of another alert, this one different from the others, heavier, unmistakable, because this time it wasn't an attempt to access my accounts. It was an attempt to move money from hers. A quiet transfer request masked as a routine adjustment, rooted through a shared profile I recognized instantly, and my hands went cold as I stared at the screen, because this wasn't about me anymore. This was about her being actively drained, without even knowing it. I called the bank immediately, my voice steady despite the panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. And within minutes the request was frozen, flagged, documented, the digital fingerprints preserved in a way that couldn't be explained away later. And when the banker confirmed the device used matched my daughter's tablet, the last piece fell into place. He wasn't just opportunistic. He was methodical, and that realization stripped away any remaining hesitation I had about what needed to happen next. I tried calling my daughter again, but she didn't answer, and when I sent a short message asking her to come see me alone, she replied hours later with a polite refusal, saying they needed space, saying things were tense, saying she didn't want drama, And I understood then that he had tightened his grip, not with force, but with narrative, making himself the calm center and me the source of chaos. That night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from urgency, because there's a narrow window between manipulation and total control, and I could feel it closing. By morning, I made a decision that would either save her or cost me everything. I would confront her with proof, not accusations, not interpretations, but facts she could see with her own eyes, even if it meant she would hate me first. When she finally agreed to meet later that day, her tone guarded and brittle, I prepared carefully, gathering statements, timestamps, device logs, everything stripped of emotion and explanation, because manipulators thrive in emotional fog, and clarity is the one thing they can't survive. She arrived tense, arms crossed, eyes already defensive, and before she could speak, I placed the documents in front of her quietly, letting the silence stretch until curiosity overcame resistance. And as she read, I watched the shift happen in real time, disbelief giving way to confusion, confusion to recognition, recognition to something like grief. She didn't cry at first, just stared, shaking her head, repeating that there had to be a mistake, that he wouldn't do this, that there had to be another explanation. And I let her talk, because denial needs room before it collapses under its own weight. When she finally looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper, and asked why he would do this, I told her the truth. Not about money, not about inheritance, but about patterns, about how control disguises itself as care, about how urgency replaces consent, and about how love doesn't require secrecy. She left shortly after, saying she needed time, saying she had to talk to him, and as I watched her drive away, I knew the confrontation that truly mattered wouldn't be between him and me, but between him and the evidence he couldn't rewrite. That evening, my attorney called with an update that made my stomach drop. He had retained legal counsel, and his lawyer had already reached out, positioning himself as the wronged party, claiming emotional distress, alleging interference, laying groundwork for a narrative where he was the victim and we were the aggressors. And suddenly everything accelerated. This wasn't a private reckoning anymore. It was becoming a legal standoff. And the quiet manipulation that had lived in shadows was now preparing to defend itself publicly. I sat alone in my living room, the weight of it pressing down on me, knowing that the next move would decide not just who was believed, but who was protected. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel the fear, not for my money, not for my reputation, but for my daughter, who was now standing directly in the path of a man who had nothing left to lose. By the next day, he wasn't hiding anymore, and the only question left was whether he would walk away quietly or try to destroy us both first. I used to believe that once the truth was visible, everything else would fall into place naturally, but I learned very quickly that exposure doesn't always bring peace. It often provokes panic, and panic makes dangerous people reckless. The day after his lawyer reached out, my daughter showed up at my house unannounced, eyes red, hands shaking, her voice barely steady enough to tell me that he had turned cold overnight, that the warmth she'd married had vanished and been replaced by calculation, threats disguised as concern, and quiet ultimatums framed as protection. She told me he had accused her of betraying him, of conspiring against him, of being manipulated by me, and hearing those words confirmed what I'd feared all along. Once control slips, manipulators don't retreat, they escalate. I listened without interrupting as she described how he'd gone through their shared accounts line by line, questioning her spending, suggesting restrictions, implying consequences, and it broke something inside me to realize that while I had been trying to protect her from a financial loss, she had been losing something far more important, her sense of autonomy, piece by piece. I didn't rush to comfort her with promises or reassurance, because this wasn't the moment for softness alone, it was the moment for grounding, for helping her see the situation clearly without feeding the narrative that she was weak or foolish. And when I finally spoke, I told her something she wasn't expecting, that none of this meant she had failed. That realization alone made her cry harder than anything else had so far, because shame is the sharpest tool manipulators use, and once it's removed, their grip weakens. Together, we went through everything again, slowly, methodically, not as mother and daughter, but as two women confronting the same threat. and when she saw how consistent the pattern was, how every move aligned with control rather than care, something in her posture changed, her shoulders straightening, her voice growing steadier, and I knew the turning point had finally arrived. That afternoon, my attorney confirmed what we already suspected. His legal positioning was aggressive but shallow, heavy on intimidation and light on substance, designed to scare rather than succeed, and that knowledge shifted the balance of power decisively. For the first time since this began, we weren't reacting, we were choosing. My daughter asked what would happen next, and I told her the truth, that there were two paths forward, one loud and one quiet, one that would burn everything down publicly, and one that would end it cleanly if he agreed to walk away. And watching her consider those options, I saw her reclaiming agency in real time. She asked whether we had leverage, and I told her yes, not threats, not rumors, but proof. Timestamps, device records, account flags, and something else I hadn't mentioned yet. Something that tipped the scale entirely. I showed her the recording from the wedding reception. The careless words spoken with confidence and alcohol. The moment he bragged about what he expected to gain. And as she listened, the last traces of doubt left her face. She didn't yell, didn't lash out, didn't even look angry. She looked resolved. And that calm terrified me more than any outburst would have, because it meant she was done being controlled. She agreed to a meeting, not at home, not privately, but in a neutral professional space with witnesses, documentation, and no room for rewriting the narrative afterward. And when she sent him the message requesting it, I watched her hands steady as she typed, the transformation unmistakable. The response came quickly, defensive, dismissive, insisting on lawyers, threatening countersuits. But it didn't matter anymore, because once someone realizes fear no longer works, the power dynamic collapses. The night before the meeting, neither of us slept much. Not from dread, but from anticipation, because we both understood that the outcome was already written, the only variable left being how loudly he would lose. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place this had all begun, and reflected on how quietly this war had been fought. No shouting, no scenes, just patience, observation, and timing. And I realized that what people call revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about removal, about ensuring someone can never harm you again. By morning, everything was prepared, documents organized, timelines aligned, statements ready. And as we drove together toward the meeting, my daughter reached for my hand, not as a child seeking protection, but as an equal acknowledging partnership. And in that moment, I knew that even if the confrontation ahead was messy, even if he resisted until the end, the most important victory had already been secured. By the time we walked into that room, he still believed he could negotiate. But he had no idea the choice he was about to face would end everything for him, permanently. The room we chose for the meeting was all glass and pale wood, intentionally unremarkable, the kind of place where nothing feels dramatic until it suddenly is. And when he walked in late, wearing confidence like armor, I understood something immediately. He still believed this was a negotiation, not an ending. He greeted us with practiced calm, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and sat down as if this were just another inconvenience he planned to manage, while my daughter remained silent beside me, posture steady, hands folded, no longer defensive, no longer unsure. The lawyer spoke first. Formalities exchanged, positions stated, and I watched him closely as each piece of documentation was placed on the table, watching the subtle shifts in his expression as timelines aligned and explanations narrowed. Because manipulation thrives on ambiguity, and we had removed every trace of it. When the device logs were introduced, showing his access attempts, his confidence thinned just slightly. And when the flag transfer from my daughter's account was outlined, he leaned back, arms crossed, insisting it was a misunderstanding, a technical error, something blown out of proportion. But the words landed flat now because they were no longer falling into uncertainty. The final blow wasn't loud or theatrical, it was quiet and surgical. The recording played calmly, without commentary, his own voice filling the room, laughing, boasting, revealing intent in a moment he'd forgotten mattered. And as it ended, the silence that followed was absolute. He didn't look at me then, didn't even look at his lawyer. He looked at my daughter, searching for something: fear, doubt, loyalty. but she gave him none of it. She spoke clearly, evenly, saying she was done. That trust once broken this thoroughly doesn't regenerate, that whatever affection had existed between them couldn't survive what he'd chosen to do, and watching her reclaim her voice in that moment was more satisfying than any punishment could have been. The terms were laid out simply: an annulment, a clean separation, full relinquishment of claims, no shared accounts, no contact, no retaliation, and in return, discretion, a quiet exit, the chance to leave without public exposure. And for the first time since I'd met him, he hesitated, because he finally understood the truth. There was nothing left to extract. He argued briefly, attempted to posture, suggested countersuits and reputational damage, but the energy had shifted, and he knew it. Because threats only work when someone is afraid to lose something, and he had already lost everything that mattered. When he signed, the pen pressed harder than necessary against the paper. It felt almost anticlimactic. And yet I knew that this moment, unremarkable on the surface, was the true conclusion, because the most effective endings don't announce themselves. He left without another word, no final glance, no apology, just the quiet departure of someone who understands too late that they miscalculated. Afterward, my daughter didn't collapse or cry the way I'd expected. Instead, she exhaled deeply, like someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying without realizing it. And she thanked me, not for the money, not for the strategy, but for not giving up on her when it would have been easier to walk away. That night, we went home together and cooked a simple meal. Nothing celebratory, just familiar comfort. And as we sat at the same table where this had all begun, she asked me finally about the inheritance, not with entitlement or curiosity, but with understanding. And when I told her the truth, she didn't react the way people expect someone to react to that number. She didn't gasp or joke or imagine possibilities. She just nodded, as if it made sense now why I'd been so careful, so quiet, so unwilling to explain myself earlier. We agreed there would be no more secrets, but also no urgency, because trust rebuilt slowly is stronger than trust forced quickly. And in the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normal, quieter than before, steadier, with fewer illusions and more intention. Sometimes I think about how close we came to losing each other, not to money, but to misunderstanding. And I know now that silence can be dangerous, but it can also be protective when used with purpose, and that love doesn't always look like reassurance or agreement. Sometimes it looks like patience and restraint, and the willingness to be misunderstood for a while. I never told many people what happened, didn't feel the need to, because the victory wasn't public and it wasn't loud. It was private, contained, and lasting. And as I watched my daughter slowly regain her confidence, her independence, her laughter, I understood that the greatest revenge I could ever have taken wasn't against the man who tried to take advantage of us. It was ensuring he would never have the opportunity to do so again. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't when someone falls, it's when they're simply removed from the story, and life moves forward without them.